No one expected Prince Edward, the quiet, duty-bound youngest son, to break the silence. But when he stood before a hushed room of senior royals and uttered the Queen Mother's final words, jaws dropped. What began as a routine family gathering turned into a moment of reckoning that would ripple through the monarchy's deepest veins. And at the heart of it all, Catherine. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room had been wrapped in tradition. A quiet corridor in Balmoral, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and silence. It wasn't meant to be anything more than a customary gathering, an exchange of holiday courtesies and reflective stories of years gone by. But then Edward stood up. His face was pale, not with fear but with the burden of something long delayed. In his hands a letter, yellowed, creased from years of secrecy, and sealed with the unmistakable crest of the Queen Mother. The others looked on, intrigued but unsuspecting, until he read the opening line, and the world inside that room shifted forever. There had always been a quiet reverence about Edward, a man often overlooked in the shadows of louder, more dominant royal personalities. But that day, it was his voice that pierced through history. The words, spoken with hesitant force, drew audible gasps from the gathering. "This is her final instruction," he said, barely above a whisper. "And it concerns Catherine." The very mention of the Princess of Wales pulled a sudden, invisible cord. Camilla's posture stiffened, her smile flickered, and William instinctively reached for his wife's hand. In that moment, the room was no longer just a gathering. It was a battlefield preparing for war. The Queen Mother, once the grand matriarch of royal strength and strategy, had left behind more than fond memories. She had left behind a command, a deeply considered decision entrusted solely to Edward, bypassing even Charles. Why now? Why after so many years of silence? Edward's eyes betrayed the torment he had held in, the weight of carrying a message that could fracture loyalties and reset the very balance of royal power. It wasn't just a message, it was a declaration, and it had chosen Catherine. What followed was a stunned silence. No one moved. Hushed gasps and rapid glances replaced conversation. Camilla's lips were pressed tightly, her discomfort no longer subtle. Beatrice and Eugenie exchanged a look of confusion, while Anne's gaze turned steely, calculating. William remained still, protective, quietly furious that this had been hidden from him. Even Charles, seasoned in emotional restraint, looked as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Because what had just been said didn't only elevate Catherine, it challenged everything that had been built since the Queen Mother's passing. It called into question the natural order of royal recognition, the invisible thrones behind the visible crowns. This wasn't a sweet posthumous gesture. It was a pointed directive, and every royal present knew that nothing said within those hallowed walls would remain there for long. But before the truth could fully take hold, the contents of that letter had to be unveiled, revealing a royal directive that had been buried for over 2 decades, tucked away in a sealed envelope, marked to be opened by Edward only. The Queen Mother's final written words were never meant for the public. But now, in a moment of royal crisis, the seal was broken, and what lay within would threaten to upend decades of royal protocol. For years, the envelope had rested in a private drawer, untouched even as monarchs passed and titles shifted. It had survived palace renovations, power struggles, and funerals. But it had not survived the truth that was now clawing its way to the surface. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, firm, and deliberate. The tone, however, revealed more than sentimentality. This wasn't a farewell letter. This was a directive, a royal decree crafted with precision and hidden in plain sight, waiting for the day the family would be forced to confront it. The Queen Mother's choice of Edward as its keeper had been no accident. Of all her children and grandchildren, he was the least embroiled in palace politics, the least prone to ambition, and the most loyal to quiet duty. And that's exactly why she entrusted him with her final request. As Edward read the letter aloud, its language struck with surprising clarity. There were no ambiguous phrases, no gentle suggestions. Catherine is to be upheld not as an extension of her husband, but as a cornerstone of the crown's future, the Queen Mother had written. The room shifted again, every word chipped away at long-guarded hierarchies, subtly yet forcefully placing Catherine in a realm that few had dared to imagine, one above symbolism, beyond title, and undeniably influential. She described Catherine in ways that were more than flattering, they were prophetic. She possesses the quiet strength of a sovereign, one line read. When the winds of monarchy shift, it is she who must steady the branches. It was more than praise, it was prediction. The Queen Mother had seen beyond the crown Camilla would wear, into a future shaped not by compromise, but by character. Catherine, she claimed, embodied the very spirit the monarchy would one day desperately need, dignified, unyielding, and untouched by scandal. A figure who could not only weather the storm, but restore the calm after. But not everyone in the room heard admiration in those words. Some heard displacement. Camilla, whose journey to acceptance had been long, painful, and hard-won, felt the thunder of something being undone. For years she had fought for legitimacy, battled public opinion, and now stood as queen consort. And yet, here was a letter, rising from the grave, subtly unraveling the perception of her place in the royal hierarchy. It wasn't a direct challenge, but it was undeniably a recalibration. One that left her watching Catherine with something new in her eyes, not condescension or contempt, but fear. There was no mistaking it. This letter wasn't just sentimental, it was a blueprint for a future that didn't center around Camilla. And if Edward had delayed its reading for this long, it was likely because he knew exactly what kind of storm it would unleash. The Queen Mother had spoken as both grandmother and monarch. Her words, though wrapped in warmth, carried the full weight of legacy. And now, that legacy was shifting in Catherine's direction, whether the rest of the family liked it or not. But the Queen Mother's words didn't end with admiration. They included an instruction that no one, not even Charles, could afford to ignore. It wasn't merely a blessing, it was a command. The Queen Mother's final order wasn't vague or ceremonial. It was direct: ensure Catherine is recognized as the future matriarch, regardless of titles held by others. With that one line, a new war had been declared within the palace. No room for misinterpretation, no ambiguity cloaked in royal etiquette. Just pure, unmistakable authority echoing from a woman who had guided the crown through abdications, world wars, and the birth of a new Elizabethan era. The weight of her instruction hit the room like a thunderclap. Not even the highest titles could shield anyone from what this truly meant. This was not a wish, it was a posthumous coronation of influence, and it instantly recast the royal order in fire. For a family built on protocol and tradition, the Queen Mother's words landed like a revolution disguised as a letter. The phrase, regardless of titles held by others, didn't whisper. It roared. It pierced the very foundation Camilla had built for herself over the years. She had weathered scrutiny, rewritten narratives, and ascended to queen consort through sheer endurance. But now, with a single sentence, the woman who never even lived to witness Camilla's full ascension had dared to override it. The letter didn't acknowledge Camilla at all, and that absence screamed louder than any insult. For Camilla, who had fought tooth and nail for legitimacy, this wasn't just a slight, it was erasure. She remained still in her seat, but her silence cracked like glass. And then there was William, his eyes fixed on the floor, but his jaw tightened with every word. Relief flickered beneath the surface. Relief that his wife, so often forced to smile through the storm, was now the central figure in a plan designed by a royal titan. Yet the joy was tempered by dread. He understood the kingdom he was born into. Recognition of one figure meant the gradual erosion of another, and this time, the erosion would not go quietly. Because this wasn't a reshuffle, it was a reckoning, a redistribution of influence so precise, so intentional, it left no room for diplomatic maneuvering. It demanded loyalty, it demanded sides. In one corner of the room, Anne and Sophie exchanged glances, not dramatic but sharp. Anne, always direct, appeared unreadable. Sophie, ever diplomatic, betrayed the slightest tremble in her hand. The order had drawn new lines in the sand, and suddenly everyone was standing on uncertain ground. Could a letter from the dead hold any real authority? Was it a symbolic testament to the Queen Mother's opinion, or something far more binding? Edward's voice, steady and unwavering, had made the implications clear. He wasn't reading a suggestion, he was delivering a mandate, one rooted in legacy, loyalty, and a fearsome clarity of vision that left no space for misinterpretation. Yet even with the room silent, everyone knew this was far from over. Because while thrones are passed in public, power is often shifted in shadows. And the Queen Mother's words had done just that, plunged the monarchy into a quiet war over who would lead its soul forward. As the room reeled, it became clear this revelation wasn't just about legacy, it was about who would lead the monarchy's future from the shadows. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She simply looked down at the floor, her silence louder than any proclamation. Catherine had always been the quiet force, the composed duchess. But now the storm had come to her doorstep, and all eyes were watching her next move. In a family known for masks of civility and theatrical restraint, her stillness spoke volumes. The letter, the command, the shift in power, it had all been detonated around her. And yet Catherine stood untouched by panic. It wasn't apathy. It was something far more deliberate. A refusal to let the chaos own her. To those watching closely, it was the kind of control only the Queen Mother herself would have admired. Dignity without retaliation. Power without noise. Behind those composed eyes, however, swirled a storm of memory. Catherine, though never paraded as the Queen Mother's favourite, had shared several rare moments with the royal matriarch, quiet conversations in garden corridors, the passing of glances in state events, and once, a tender hand on her shoulder after a particularly cold reception from senior royals. At the time they felt small. Now they echoed like prophecy. The Queen Mother had seen something. Not just a well-mannered duchess, but a future pillar, one who would hold the monarchy's soul when its walls began to crack. Catherine's rise hadn't been swift. It had been earned in silence, in self-restraint, in standing firm while others unravelled. She had not climbed through ambition. She had endured through purpose. The public, as always, watched with fascination. But this time something was different. Before any official palace statement could be crafted, headlines began to swirl. Queen Mother's secret endorsement of Catherine, a quiet queen in waiting. The narrative took on a life of its own. Commentators who had once labelled her too passive now praised her poise. Social media erupted with admiration, hashtags flooding with support. And still Catherine said nothing. Because in the monarchy, silence is often more powerful than speech. Every minute she refrained from defending herself, from clarifying or correcting, was another minute the world drew its own conclusion. She was ready. Yet inside the palace, the emotional toll was heavy. Alone with William later that night, her composure trembled, if only for a moment. Was this what she wanted? A battle she never started? William, ever the protector, held her hand with quiet intensity. He wasn't just a husband now, he was the bridge between her and a family grappling with division. Was he proud? Absolutely. But beneath his pride lived the weight of history. He knew better than anyone what it meant to be chosen, and how dangerous that spotlight could become. Because while Catherine remained still on the surface, behind the scenes the monarchy was stirring. Her sill. Ents may have shielded her in public, but it had ignited urgency in private. Whispers turned into warnings, and the old guard began to plot. Yet even as Catherine held her composure, forces were moving swiftly behind the scenes, determined to contain if not destroy the fallout. Camila had fought too hard, endured too much scandal and scorn to be sidelined now. Within hours of Edward's revelation, she summoned her loyal aides. If they want a fight, we'll give them one. What followed was a swift, calculated bid to suppress the Queen Mother's final command. The Queen Consort was not about to surrender her hard-earned position to a ghost's decree. She had clawed her way out of public disdain, redefined her image through relentless persistence, and now she stood at the apex of royal influence. But this letter, this final whisper from the past, threatened to unravel it all. And Camila, ever the survivor, knew that silence was not an option. She needed to control the story, before the story controlled her. Inside a private chamber, far from public eyes, a war room was formed. Not with military maps or intelligence briefings, but with palace insiders, PR strategists, and a handful of trusted friends who had been with her since the beginning. The strategy was simple: cast doubt, question motives, and muddy the waters. The first strike was subtle but sharp, leaks suggesting the letter's authenticity could not be verified. Quiet conversations with journalists hinted at curious timing. Why had Edward waited so long? Why now, just as Camilla's public standing had reached its peak? And the most cutting whisper of all, had Catherine known in advance? Was this a carefully orchestrated move, hidden under layers of royal duty? The press, always hungry for palace intrigue, took the bait. Headlines shifted from admiration to suspicion. Editorials speculated on internal manipulation. Just like that, Camilla had planted seeds of doubt, not only in the public mind but within the royal household itself. Advisors who had once stood firmly beside Edward now wavered. Some questioned his motives. Others began quietly aligning with Camilla again, uncertain of where the true center of gravity now lay. The power was still Charles's to wield, but influence no longer followed tradition. It followed momentum. Caught in the middle were the palace staff, those who had served loyally under both households. Lines blurred. Allegiances became dangerous. Every word spoken in private now felt like a potential headline. Security details changed without notice. Emails were suddenly monitored. Phones were left unanswered. A new kind of fear had set in, not of scandal but of irrelevance. And Camilla thrived in that space. Her strength had always been knowing when to strike with subtlety and when to strike with fire. Now she prepared for both, but even Camilla, ever calculating, couldn't account for one thing: the growing paranoia within her own circle. Whispers of betrayal, questions about who had first mentioned the sealed letter to the media. Was someone inside her own team leaking for leverage? Was Charles aware of the meeting she held that evening? Or worse, was he distancing himself already? The Queen Consort had not yet lost, but the walls around her had begun to murmur. And in the monarchy, when the walls murmur, they often collapse without warning. But while Camilla moved to defend her throne in all but name, another royal made a startling decision, one that would ignite new alliances. She's known as the most no-nonsense royal, but even Anne had limits. And when she stepped into the chaos with a bold statement in favor of Catherine, the palace was shaken to its core. Mother would never have allowed this kind of disrespect, she said. And suddenly, Camilla wasn't outmaneuvered, she was outnumbered. Anne had remained stoic during the initial fallout, letting the others scramble in confusion and whispers. But silence was never the same as indifference. When she finally spoke, it wasn't in half-truths or veiled warnings. It was a declaration sharpened with history and loyalty. The Queen Mother had been her anchor, her guiding force, and now Anne made it clear she would not let that legacy be manipulated by fear or ambition. Her voice carried more than opinion. It carried the weight of memory. Anne recounted for the first time in decades the moment she saw the sealed letter in her mother's hand. A solemn day shortly before the Queen Mother's final decline, when she had asked Anne to deliver the envelope to Edward. She had never read the contents herself, but she remembered the gravity with which her mother pressed the letter into her palm. "He'll know when," were the Queen Mother's words. Anne admitted she had been bound by a promise, not of secrecy alone, but of timing. And now, hearing what had been written, she felt that promise fulfilled. It was no longer just a private decision. It was a call to uphold something greater than protocol, her mother's will. Her sudden alignment with Edward changed the landscape entirely. No longer was it a solitary brother stirring trouble. It was the Queen's daughter reinforcing the letter's authority. And she did so not as a gesture of familial favour toward Catherine, but as a preservation of the Queen Mother's legacy. The family dynamic split further, sharp and visible. On one side, Anne and Edward, calm, resolute, invoking the weight of tradition. On the other, Charles and Camilla, defensive, shaken, and increasingly isolated. Remained neutral in public, but his eyes followed Anne with a new sense of clarity. Something fundamental had shifted. Outside the family walls, the ripple effect began to spread. Palace staff, those long accustomed to silence began to murmur. Anecdotes about Catherine's quiet resilience, stories of her humility in difficult moments, began to surface in the press. Some came forward, anonymously, to speak of the Queen Mother's subtle favoritism during rare interactions with Catherine. The narrative, once controlled by Camilla's circle, was slipping, and no one could miss the symbolism. While Camila held the crown, it was Catherine who now held the people. For Camila, this was the beginning of a deeper unraveling. The influence she had amassed so carefully began to erode not through confrontation, but through erosion of trust. Even those who once defended her started stepping back, questioning her responses, reconsidering their loyalties. The Queen Consort had once fought the tabloids and won, but this battle wasn't in the newspapers. It was in the hearts of those who mattered inside the palace walls. And Anne had just reminded them all what loyalty to legacy really looked like. But just when the royal family thought they had absorbed the shock, an even more personal revelation emerged, one tied to the Queen Mother's legacy itself. Hidden inside an antique music box passed down from the Queen Mother, a tiny velvet pouch contained something far more valuable than jewels, a locket with a portrait of Elizabeth and a folded note for Catherine. "You will know when the time is right." It was a whisper from the grave, an heirloom, a symbol, and a warning. The music box itself had been dismissed as a sentimental trinket, long forgotten in Clarence House, resting in a cabinet untouched since the Queen Mother's passing. But Edward had kept it, quietly, deliberately, without ever mentioning its true significance. Until now. In the aftermath of Anne's declaration, as tensions boiled over and silence became unbearable, Edward opened the box. What he found inside stunned even him. This wasn't just a token, it was a second revelation, one sealed not in ink but in legacy. The locket, wrapped in worn velvet, bore an inscription barely visible, through stillness, strength. Inside was a delicate portrait of the Queen Mother, framed beside a youthful Queen Elizabeth. But the note, folded tightly and yellowed by time, was what shattered the room's composure. For Catherine, it read, with the Queen Mother's unmistakable script, "You will know when the time is right." There were no instructions, no explanation. Just trust, deep, unshakable trust. Those words struck like a bell through the palace corridors. It was the kind of message that didn't need elaboration, because everyone who saw it or heard of it understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't just a private gift. It was a transfer of essence, a silent coronation cloaked in symbolism. Catherine wasn't merely favoured, she was chosen. The impact was immediate, both publicly and privately. Staff who once dared not take sides began murmuring about the music box, the note, the timing. The press, already vibrating with speculation, seized the narrative. Headlines proclaimed it, the Queen Mother's locket, a hidden message for the next matriarch. Social media turned reverent. And yet, through all the noise, one reaction left the palace shaken. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, broke down in tears, not out of envy or bitterness, but something more profound. Recognition. She had once believed herself close to the Queen Mother. She had held on to her own quiet bond with the royal matriarch. But this moment, this undeniable signal toward Catherine, erased doubt. It wasn't about favoritism. It was about purpose. And Sophie, in that moment of release, whispered only one thing to Catherine. She knew who you were before the rest of us did. And then, finally, Catherine spoke. One sentence. Simple but sharp enough to draw silence. She left this not to crown me but to remind us who we're meant to be. It wasn't a declaration of power, it was a command for integrity, a moment where Catherine transformed from the woman being spoken for to the woman everyone now looked to. Not even Camila could respond. Because this wasn't politics, it was prophecy fulfilled. The palace, still echoing from Edward's reading and Anne's defiance, now bowed under the quiet weight of Catherine's rise, anchored not in ambition but in meaning. Now the Queen Mother's voice echoed louder than ever, and the time for whispers had passed. A reckoning was underway. Caught between his wife's growing resentment and his family's mounting pressure, Charles faced a harrowing truth. The monarchy's future could not carry both Camilla's ambition and the Queen Mother's wishes. In a midnight walk through Windsor, he was overheard saying, "I should have listened to her. Even in death, she sees clearer than I." Those who knew Charles intimately had always understood his struggle, the battle between heart and crown, between personal redemption and the brutal expectations of legacy. But now, with the Queen Mother's final order igniting a fire across royal lines, that internal conflict could no longer remain hidden. He was no longer just a husband defending his partner. He was a monarch standing at the edge of a kingdom threatening to split in two. His mind raced back to the final year of the Queen Mother's life. Their conversations had grown less frequent, but more piercing. She had warned him, not with condemnation but with clarity. "Camilla will ask for more than the crown allows," she once said, "and Catherine will carry what the crown needs." At the time, he had brushed it off as wistful sentiment. But now, with the locket revealed, with Anne and Edward speaking with conviction, with the public slowly pivoting toward Catherine, not through declaration but through trust, he realized those words were not prediction, they were instruction, and he had failed to heed them. In the privacy of the palace's inner chambers, Charles called for a rare meeting. Only 3 were present: William, Edward, and himself. No aides, no Camilla. The conversation was not cold, it was devastating. He did not speak as king, but as a son and a father. With heavy eyes, he asked one question: "Can we survive this together?" William remained silent, his loyalty to Catherine spoken through stillness. Edward, steadfast, reminded his brother that the Queen Mother had not chosen a side out of favoritism but out of necessity. "This wasn't to shame anyone," Edward said, "but to prevent what we're watching unfold now." In that moment, Charles didn't argue. He nodded. The next day, the first sign of a shift emerged. A discreet directive was sent to review the internal operations and advisory structure within Camilla's household. Nothing loud, nothing official. But those who received the instruction understood what it meant. For the first time, Charles was creating distance, not from Camilla personally, but from the machinery she had built around herself, a royal household within a household. And now its power was under scrutiny. He had not betrayed her, but he had stopped defending her blindly. Through it all, Catherine remained graceful, unthreatened. She made no statement, refused all interviews, and declined any additional appearances. But that very restraint forced Charles to see the contrast that had been in front of him for years. The Queen Mother had seen it first, and now the monarch himself could no longer deny it. The woman who had never asked for power had just become the most powerful presence in the royal family. A decision loomed, one Charles knew would define not just his reign, but the monarchy's future. But just as a fragile piece seemed possible, a final twist, long buried, would erupt into daylight and rewrite everything. In a move no one expected, Charles issued a rare royal directive. By the will of the Queen Mother and the council of this family, Catherine shall be honoured as the keeper of our legacy. Gasps echoed. Camilla stood frozen. And in that moment, the monarchy was reborn, not in tradition, but in reckoning. The words were simple, but the meaning was seismic. For centuries, royal declarations had been reserved for titles, duties, and ceremonial changes. But this was something else. This was spiritual succession. Not a crown, not a throne, but something more elusive and far more powerful. Legacy. A word that outlives reigns, that lingers in public memory long after royal titles fade. And now it belonged to Catherine. The directive was read in a formal setting, but the tension was anything but ceremonial. Charles's tone was not triumphant. It was deliberate, nearly sorrowful. A man aware of what he was giving and what he was surrendering. Camilla, blindsided by the announcement, rose in protest. She challenged the decision with a tremor in her voice, not of fear, but disbelief. This was not the script she had spent years rewriting, her gaze locked on Charles, demanding an explanation. But the king, firm and composed, delivered a final sentence that silenced the room. "This is not about status. It is about survival." And with that, he closed the chapter of denial that had shadowed the palace for weeks. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Media outlets erupted with the news, headlines branding Catherine as the people's matriarch and the Queen Mother's true heir. Commentators who had once speculated about her silence now praised her poise. Royal watchers declared a new era, not defined by title, but by trust. Catherine had done what no one else could. She had risen without asking, and led without ruling. She became a symbol not just of continuity, but of quiet revolution. And the people, fatigued by scandal and drama, embraced her with renewed hope. For Edward, the moment was both an ending and a beginning. The burden he had carried for years, the letter, the silence, the duty, was now lifted. His voice, once seen as peripheral in the royal machine, had been the spark that reignited its soul. As he stepped away from the ceremony, emotion flickered across his face. It wasn't pride, it was peace. He had fulfilled what the Queen Mother had entrusted to him, and in doing so, had changed the course of royal history. Later that evening, away from the crowds, Catherine visited the Queen Mother's grave. Alone, she placed the locket gently upon the stone, whispering words only the two of them would ever know. It wasn't for show. It was for closure, for gratitude, and perhaps for strength, because even as the winds of recognition blew in her favor, the clouds of tension had not cleared. Camila may have been publicly quiet, but silence from within the palace never meant surrender. The Queen Mother's legacy had found its vessel, but peace was far from secured. The Queen Mother's order may have been her last, but its consequences have only just begun. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.